Okay, let's get started. Well, hello and welcome to Supporting Election Officials, what tech companies should be doing to safeguard our information environment. I'm Carah Whaley. I'm the Director of Election Protection at Issue One, a leading nonpartisan organization in Washington, D.C. that is uniting Republicans, Democrats, and independents in the movement to build a more inclusive political system that works for everyone. Thank you all so much for spending time with us today. We are gathering at a moment when partisan extremists and foreign adversaries are determined to undermine Americans' confidence in elections and to promote inflammatory false information about how elections are run. Any individual now has easy access to generative artificial intelligence technologies at their disposal, and the social media platforms essentially have zero accountability for hosting and promoting deepfake content. We've seen rogue actors are ready to flood the information environment and make it exponentially harder for the average voter to determine fact from fiction. If 2016 was the election of alternative facts, this one could potentially be the election of artificial ones. Election officials across the country are bearing the brunt of our toxic information environment. Their responsibilities have expanded into correcting false information and monitoring threats of physical violence. Instead of helping local election officials, social media companies have actively reduced the capacity of those on the front lines of our democracy to flag false information on their platforms. And on top of that, we are awaiting a decision from the United States Supreme Court in the Murphy versus Missouri case that will determine how and if the government requesting such content to be taken down violates the First Amendment. Joining us today to talk about the complexities facing us this election cycle are three experts and practitioners in this space. I want to thank Nevada Secretary of State, Cisco Aguilar. He holds both a JD and an MBA and has had a diverse experience across both academic and business sectors. In 2022, Secretary Aguilar ran for Nevada Secretary of State and won against an election denier who was present at the Capitol on January 6th. As Secretary of State in Nevada, Secretary Cisco has been working to restore trust in Nevada's voting system and elections. Also joining us today is Jiore Craig. She's a resident senior fellow focusing on digital integrity at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and she's also a member of Issue One's Council for Responsible Social Media. Jiore has studied the impacts of the information environment on elections for years, and previously shared her expertise as an expert witness before the U.S. House Committee on Administration, discussing election disinformation created by both domestic and international actors. And finally, we have with us Kim Wyman, who has had an illustrious 30-year career in elections, serving as the Thurston County Elections Director, County Auditor, and a Secretary of State in Washington. Secretary Wyman was appointed as the Senior Election Security Advisor for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and is currently a Senior Fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center supporting their elections project. She's also a member of Issue One's National Council on Election Integrity. Thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us. Secretary Aguilar, I want to start with you. Can you just give us a sense of what it's like on the front lines for election officials working in this broken and toxic information environment?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here, and it's good to see Kim and the rest of the crew. But, you know, we're in the middle of today's the last day of early voting in Nevada. We have our Nevada primary on Tuesday. And so it's been fascinating to see the process play out, to look at our legacy systems operate throughout our 17 counties, to see our poll workers come to the forefront to run and manage our elections during a time when it's tough to be an election worker, but also too understanding what we're dealing with in this media sector and the challenges we're facing in getting real information out to voters. There's a couple issues that I think it's important to know is I believe a lot of you, hopefully you've all read the New York Times article about Esmeralda County and our elections clerk there. You talk about a woman who's dedicated her entire life to a community and has done everything with great integrity and transparency. And to see her go through what she's going through now, it's just heartbreaking. You know, we know these issues, we talk to them about these issues, we try to help them. But when you see it in the words as they were portrayed yesterday, it just brings it to the forefront and makes this so real. And the fact that national elections are being run at the local level like Esmeralda County. And not only did she dedicate her life to her community, but her husband served as sheriff in that county for a couple decades. So you know that they are committed beyond belief to what they're doing, and they're going to do it with just complete care and just loyalty. And then to see what she's experiencing, I think is a true portrayal at the very, very local level. And again, it comes back to how are we getting to where we are? And I think one is we have to recognize the role of the media, the traditional media, right? It's the people we trust with journalism to do the job we need them to do. The paywalls that are up on some of these more traditional outlets, that's preventing information getting down to that true voter. We talk about how do we educate voters? How do we educate the common Nevadan about the issues and the challenges? Well, when news organizations put up paywalls on election articles or issues related to elections, that information isn't getting out to that average voter. It's getting out to us who we want to pay for that information because it helps us do our job. But the person we want to have that information is not getting it. The other thing is the responsibility of the traditional media to do their homework and make sure they are putting accurate information out into the universe. Because it's important for journalists to understand the statute in that local state or that local community before writing an article that discusses the implications of those statutes. You know, when information is put out there that's not accurate, it's not the journalist that's going to take the backlash. It's us, local election officials, are going to take the backlash. We've had that happen this week and the last week. We came out with new guidance on how we are going to tabulate ballots to get the information to Nevadans when they want it election night. And because accurate information has been put out there, what my team has gone through with the backlash of that inaccurate information has been pretty significant. And we're only in a primary race. And so that's been a real eye-waking experience to say, okay, what is it we need to step back and do? How do we get reporters and journalists to understand the implications of their work? They're not going to, again, they're going to think I'm the liar, that I'm the one that's trying to dupe the system. In reality, that's not true. We are continuing to look at the law. We are following the law. We have no room for error. And so it does make our life harder. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Aguilar. And I just want to point out something that you mentioned. We're seeing the increased threats, harassment, and abuse of election workers all across the country. But I also want to note what's amazing in talking to all of them, in talking to many of them across the country, is their resilience and their willingness to continue to pound sand and get out there, and their commitment to running safe and secure elections this year, despite the narratives, despite what's happening on social media, and despite them being at the front end of receiving this threats, harassment, and abuse because of the false information. So thank you for sharing that specific story. We'll have Willa drop a link in the chat to that New York Times article so folks can link to it directly. Jiore, I want to turn to you. ISD has been conducting continual monitoring and investigation of threats that appear on social media, and more broadly about our election and information environment. What, in your view, are the most substantial threats that we are facing in this year?
Well, I think, and thank you for having me. It's a delight to be speaking about this and delight to be speaking with both the Secretary and former Secretary. I would say that the biggest threat that we face in 2024, in the context of the conversation we're having around the tech companies, would be that I could look at any online harm or online threat across the internet, and in every case, I would run up against the challenge of what to do about it accountability-wise once I had come across it. As you alluded to, there are really a limited set of safeguards in place for actioning the threats we do see. I can speak to you at length about the increase in violent rhetoric and threats to election workers and threats to election officials. I can talk about how that is a strategy deployed to specifically create a chilling effect and democratic backslide for really removing people from the political process, either because they are threatened and intimidated and they pull themselves out, or because they are worn down over time and experience fatigue, which really moves them into sort of a position of submission. But all of that is undermined even further when the tech companies refuse to commit to data transparency, when they gut their trust and safety teams, when they cut off access in August, right before the election, to one of the most helpful tools that they have, CrowdTangle. And it's sort of inconsistent across each platform, but that is undermining all of the information landscape. The other dynamic is we hear a lot about AI and the threat of AI generated information threats. And what I emphasize to folks is that regardless of the information threat, whether or not it is AI generated or not, we have the problem of both. We can have the most beautiful messages in the world to counter or inoculate people, but if we don't have messengers to reach those voters, we're really wasting a lot of time and energy actually putting things out there that are never getting consumed. And it's not just about trust, it's also about attention. The companies are monetizing our attention and bifurcating our attention. So anyone trying to do the good work of countering election disinformation or warning voters about what they might see online is dually challenged by the information landscape we find ourselves in. So I'd say that that is the bigger threat to me than any one particular information threat, because if we are in, for example, a short time horizon before an election date, like we've seen in Slovakia and other parts of Europe, where there is only about 48 to 24 hours to counter a threat, a disinformation threat, especially, we will struggle. We will struggle to have the messengers and mechanisms to reach voters at scale. And I think that's what we're thinking a lot about as we think about how to build audiences and be able to reach people with information in multiple different ways.
That's such an amazing point, Jiore. I know we're spending a lot of time thinking about this and grappling with these challenges, but we can think and talk about it, but we also have to make sure that we're actually doing something about it. And we're going to spend some more time in this conversation talking about those things later in the conversation. But we'll continue down our gloom and doom scenario discussion for just a moment. Secretary Wyman, you have a lot of expertise in national security, and I'm wondering if you can speak about how our foreign adversaries are sowing divisions in our country and undermining confidence in election systems. Just last week, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee said that we are less prepared this year than we were in 2020. So can you just give us a sense of what we're facing?
Oh, absolutely. I'd like to start with remembering that the goal of foreign influence operations is to spread disinformation, to sow discord, and ultimately to undermine confidence that people have in our democratic institutions and values. And make no mistake, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea all share this goal because they want to undermine the US and bring it down from within by causing division and discord, pitting Americans against each other. And the tactics that we've seen them use to try to achieve this goal in US elections really include cyber attacks and misinformation campaigns. So let me give you a couple of real world examples that we've seen over the last 8 years across the country. I think most of the people on this call will remember that in 2016, we experienced our first cyber attacks on the US election system, and they continue to be a serious threat to this day. Thanks to the intelligence community and the Senate Intelligence Committee report, we know that Russia scanned all 50 states' voter registration systems and websites looking for vulnerabilities in 2016. And I think the Illinois State Board of Elections experience demonstrates the scope and the scale of these attacks because Russia was successful in getting into the Illinois State Board of Elections. Cyber investigators at the federal level were able to determine in 2016 that Russia was attacking the Illinois State Board of Elections voter registration system 5 times a second, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I mention this because this is the level of threat that all 8,800 state and local election offices around the country, from Esmeralda County, Nevada to Los Angeles County, California, from nation state actors like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And remember, they're successful even when election systems are secure. Cybersecurity experts notify states when they find voter registration data on the dark web. And in most cases, it's publicly available data. But the hackers claim to have gained access into those voter registration systems, which leads me to the second, tool in their toolbox, and that's disinformation campaigns. Disinformation campaigns are Cold War era propaganda tactics that have been modernized. It's easier for our adversaries to reach average Americans in their living rooms today than ever before. And an example of a disinformation campaign that our foreign adversaries use is seen on social media. They begin by creating news websites that post fabricated news stories. And they also create hundreds of thousands of individual social media user accounts that appear to be Americans, but are actually bots. Then they take these bot farms and they use these fabricated personas on social media to amplify and spread those false news stories. And even though this isn't an election example, it's a very current example we're seeing play out in the Ukrainian war. This type of activity happened both in 2016 and 2020. So what they've found is that there's over 150 fake local news websites that have been identified as pushing Russian propaganda to US audiences. And they look like real American news sites. The DC Weekly, New York News Daily, and the Boston Times. These false news stories are posted on fake local news sites. The fabricated American personas on social media platforms post these stories on their pages and in user groups to amplify and spread those false stories. And they've already seen a great deal of success spreading many false stories surrounding the war in Ukraine. So remember, the goal of these cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns is to sow discord and ultimately undermine confidence in our democratic institutions and values. And we've seen the outcome of these efforts in the aftermath of 2020. There's been a sharp increase in physical security threats, as Carah mentioned. We've seen harassment and threats of physical violence to state and local election officials, to election workers and voters across the country. I believe this is a result of people believing the disinformation campaigns. And we've seen attacks on infrastructure, from angry protests at election offices and voting centers to the January 6th protests. So remember that foreign influence operations effectively spread disinformation, they sow discord, and ultimately they undermine people's confidence in our US democratic institutions.
It is really haunting. And, I was having a conversation last week with Arizona Secretary of State, Adrian Fontes. And one of the things he noted was, when talking to his election workers, one of the things when he's asking what they need, he said they've responded, "We need a ballistic wall." Right. I mean, this is the era that we are now in, because the threat of political violence has been raised to a new level this year. Secretary Wyman, you also mentioned the proliferation of fake news sites. And we have seen in monitoring the proliferation of fake news sites and also pink slime sites. Those are partisan specific news sites that people think are news, but they are powered by a political party. But with the combination of those, there are now more AI generated fake news sites and pink slime news sites than there are actual local news organizations. So just let that sink in, particularly in this environment. And so we have to do something about it. And given that AI is playing this role and that anyone can use these technologies now to generate a fake news site, also to create audio or video very easily. My question to all of you is, how do you think we're likely to see generative AI being used? And how do you think it might impact public perceptions of the election?
I had the great opportunity to participate in the AI Democracy Project with Dr. Alondra Nelson from the Institute of Advanced Studies, and to test Nevada specifically in 5 different chatbots. deep fakes are a big concern. Obviously, Secretary Fontes in Arizona did an extremely great job in testing and educating folks on the impact of a deep fake. But again, it goes back to the information we don't know is being given out. For example, one of the falsehoods in the chatbots was if a person went in and said, "What do I need to do to register to vote in Nevada for the upcoming election?" The result was you need to register 3 weeks before the election. Well, that's not true. In Nevada, we have same-day voter registration. And we know young people are going to probably be the ones using the chatbots for this type of information. And it's probably a first-time voter. It's 2 weeks before the election. They do that, and they walk away thinking, "Oh, I missed it, next time." But in reality, that was voter disenfranchisement at its best, right? Because we lost a young voter. We lost an opportunity to engage somebody. And the power of the Nevada vote is significant. We are a battleground state. We are a purple state. We're a swing state. And in this presidential cycle, that vote from that youth member could have been significant because that individual could have gone on his social media account, told all of his friends, "Oh, we missed our opportunity to vote." So I think that's the scariest part of this AI revolution within this election. But how do we know and how do we correct that information? Again, I had an opportunity to speak at the ESPN Institute with a bunch of the representatives from the chatbots and the AI community. And when you talk about this and you talk about what their priorities at the moment are their investors, are proving to their investors that the investment is working and that their product is worth additional investment. They're not thinking about the election struggles or the election issues we're facing on the ground. They're thinking about their investors and the product moving forward.
Okay, I'll jump in here. So that's one set of threats that we anticipate generative AI is going to do. And I know it's a really hot topic, but at the end of the day, right now, we have no idea how it's going to be used in this election. We're starting to get, some glimpses of it. But I think the area that concerns me the most is not so much what deepfakes can do and how someone could amplify or could mimic through a deepfake Secretary Aguilar and send out a message to voters near election day, which is certainly a threat with misinformation. I think the things that concern me most about generative AI are the capability it has of doing all of the things we were talking about in the cyber attack space at scale. And what I mean by that is that doing a denial of service attack on the phone lines or the email system or a website of an election official on election day, or being able to do that at scale across every election office in the country with generative AI is a huge threat, or being able to do all of the cyber attacks that we know are happening every single day online, again, at scale. And I say that as that's the scary part, but I have to give a huge shout out to CISA and to all of the organizations that are working in this space and helping election officials start to think through the potential threats that generative AI causes that is making to their operations. And they're doing tabletop exercises like the one that was just happened in Arizona with Secretary Fontes, and really taking time to think about not what necessarily what the threat is, but how they're going to respond when it happens. What happens if your website completely goes down on election day? What happens if your phone lines are so jammed, callers can't get in? And I think that that's the part that gives me hope going into 2024, is that election officials are focusing on resiliency. They're focusing on how they're going to respond to these attacks and trying to make sure that they're ready no matter what comes at them on election day.
And I'll jump in. We've actually been able to see in the elections in Europe and the elections in other parts of the world how AI might be used. And I agree with what both secretaries have said about, sort of what needs to happen regardless of what ends up happening in the US, because any of the things I'm about to mention could happen. We don't know where they'll happen, and we don't know in what kind of national versus hyper localized way they will happen. But before I go into just these three buckets quickly, I want to say that the platform policies around AI are mostly not happening. They range from non-existent to mildly to limitedly effective. Most of them are just placeholders to say they have a policy. We know that they don't have the detection capacity they would need to catch all of the AI generated threats. They also don't have the verification capacity they would need to communicate about what is verified. So we're in a dual challenge, and those technical solutions are not likely to come in 2024. On top of that, we have the data access limitation, which is another challenge. Then in terms of the 3 categories of threat that our team looks at, the first is coordinated inauthentic activity, which is something that's already happening but is made easier by AI. And so that's inflated online metrics. So you can imagine making it easier to make it look like there's a lot of people talking about something when actually there's not a lot of people or any real people at all talking about something. It's also much easier to flood systems with requests and filings and inbounds. We've already seen how certain bad actors have really inundated election offices with FOIA requests and constituent calls that they have to respond to. That really overwhelms offices, and that is much easier to do in an automated fashion. And then rapid content production. So to the point that Secretary Wyman made about the production of news articles and news outlets, that's something made easier with AI. The next is manipulated audio, video, and images. And often that audio, video, images are highly personal and include extremely convincing impersonation tactics. So we've seen examples of voice cloning already happening. We've seen scam robocalls, text messages, AI-generated videos. And when we're thinking about where that could be really bad is that false emergency announcement scenario that I mentioned, especially on a short time horizon. And then also when it's coming to a voter in a very personal closed space that is not likely to have any other information in it. So a text message, or even in, for example, for diaspora communities, a WhatsApp group, or another group that they're in, potentially in non-English, which increases even the chances further that there won't be anything countering that. So we worry about that. And then finally, just biased search results. So biased training models and biased search results that are manipulated via SEO hacking. And that can be disinformation in search results about voting outcomes, processes, and rules. And all of this is made worse if we make the same mistake we've made in the past when we've only talked about fake news and the actual content of the disinformation. The mistake we made there is in only talking about the content, we ignored the systems around the content that were actually amplifying them, including platform product features, but also just the incentives that these actors have to engage in behaviors. So I'm hoping that because the range of threats AI poses is more vast, we can keep the conversation on behaviors and systems and not on a conversation about content, which gets us into a trap around speech that's actually a complete distraction from what is going on with the very controlled thumb on the nail, not so free speech environment that these platforms have. So I'm hopeful that the AI topic breaks that open in a way that we could use going forward for accountability.
Well, Jiore, that's a perfect segue to the next question I have for you all, which is at the intersection both of what the platforms can do, but also the chilling effect that has been in place between cooperation about what's occurring on the platforms because of the lawsuit that ended up in the Supreme Court that is now Murphy v. Missouri. And the Supreme Court is going to be ruling about the kinds of coordination that can occur between the federal government and the social media companies, with substantial implications for elections. The original case was actually about COVID and vaccines, but the ruling is going to have significant implications for looking at what's happening system-wide on social media platforms with regards to the spread of information. So I wonder if you all can speak to how the outcome in Murphy v. Missouri might impact the ability of both government and non-governmental entities to address the spread of false election information through social media and other digital platforms.
Well, I can speak to that, both that Supreme Court decision and also some other Supreme Court decisions that have been highly relevant, where the tech companies have been NetChoice, the main tech lobby, has been up against other forms of digital policy that have come out of states. And we're kind of seeing this both at the state level with new legislation, but also, there was NetChoice versus Paxton, which was the response to digital policy in Texas and Florida. And now there's also this Murthy case as well. What I would like to say about all of them, not knowing exactly how familiar the audience will be, is that in all of these cases, we're watching the tech companies engage in a similar behavior where they want to keep the conversation in a place where they can be talking about their potential First Amendment protections. We saw an interesting shift in one of the most recent hearings. I think it was for NetChoice versus Paxton, where for the first time, instead of saying that the tech companies are, a la Section 230, not they don't have editorial control and they just have content moving through them, the NetChoice pivoted and actually said, no, they are more like a newspaper, and they do have free speech protection requirements, and that any regulation would potentially be threatening their free speech as companies. Now, that's a huge pivot for those who have been following the way they've operated in the policy space for a really long time. And I think going forward, I don't want to say specifically like how the Murthy decision would impact all offices and how they would have to approach the companies, because they're already having to approach the companies in a challenged, frenzied way, because of recent leadership changes in the companies. And there's only a few of the companies, so those leadership changes at even one affects the ecosystem quite greatly. But what I will say for sure is that there has to be an ongoing exploration of how free speech is protected in this conversation, because without a real focus and experts who are looking at where there really is a free speech environment and protections, and there's been great work done by organizations like Free Press on this, looking at like really where in these conversations is free speech being protected. If we don't have that really critical conversation from experts who have a background in free speech protection, I worry that there is a lot of bluster coming from companies and coming from people who are just choosing to frame conversations around speech so they can avoid accountability. And we're seeing that not happen in places like Europe, and who have passed really relevant legislation. And I hope it is the case that we can stay on top of these cases and these policy developments to ensure that there is sort of systems level accountability for the companies. I'll end there. You can tell I could go on and on about this. I feel very strongly.
I'm happy to give you my time. Because this is obviously not a topic I'm very educated about, and so there's not much I can say other than it's a wild time.
Well, in 2020, I was Secretary of State in Washington, and this was an election where we really started to see the maturity of foreign adversaries, in particular, using disinformation and misinformation campaigns pretty widely to really confuse voters in the COVID pandemic related to their rights and abilities to vote in the election. And again, I just want to kind of foot stomp that Russia loves to use the First Amendment against us. It's one of our strongest, one of the strongest things about American society is the right to say what you want and have free speech protected. And they use that against us. And we certainly saw that in 2020. And as an election official in the heat of battle, it was really difficult because what we found was people were putting things about the time, manner, and place of elections that were not true. And so we were trying to figure out how to connect with the social media companies to say, hey, this particular user on social media or this website is saying that, there's going to be long lines on election day, so you can go ahead and wait till Wednesday to vote if you are fill in the line, a Republican or a woman or whatever. And we were afraid, of course, it would confuse voters because they can't vote on Wednesday. So we were working with the social media companies, and what evolved in that time period was connecting through the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. And they were just kind of taking those calls and giving them to the social media companies. And I think to your point and question about the Murphy versus Missouri case, I think what it's really done is had a chilling effect on those relationships. So in the negative space, the challenge becomes, how do we take down content that is incorrect about the time, manner, and place of elections? Because this is in law, and this is a space where election officials can take down information that is incorrect or false, or trying to suppress activity and voters' participation. So it's a challenge on that front, but at the same time, I think it's healthy, because I think that if there's a good thing that will come out of this case, is it's making government from the federal level to the local level be very cognizant about the power that it wields. And I can tell you, as Secretary of State, I felt that. And when I was at CISA, we were always cognizant of running everything we were going to do by our attorneys for privacy concerns, and making sure that we weren't violating anyone's First Amendment rights. And it felt very bureaucratic when I was at the feds, but now I appreciate that, because that process has to protect the rights of every U.S. citizen. It has to protect access to information, and it's a tough balance. So I think the lawsuit has a chilling effect, but I think ultimately it's probably been a good gut check for government.
Well, thank you so much. I really want to get to, Jiore has mentioned this. We've seen changes in leadership among the tech companies. We've also seen the gutting of election integrity teams on the social media companies. I really want to ask you all, what would you like to see the platforms do in this moment that would actually contribute to mitigating harms, both specifically to election workers, but more broadly to the public? And what do you think they can do?
I'll jump in on this one first, just to mix it up. If I had a magic wand and could wave it, I would say, for me, the top priority would be the companies prioritizing the identification, and then the elimination of fake user accounts on social media, and having some method for users to verify their accounts, like we used to have on, one of the platforms that I won't name, but now you have to pay for. But this is what, just that action would help reduce some of the creation and amplification of false narratives around the election. And I think it would help to slow the progress that these foreign malign influence campaigns have on American voters. So if I had one thing I would point to, that would be what it is.
Secretary Aguilar. Oh no. Go ahead, Jiore.
Well, I'm happy to go. I will repeat that I think data access for researchers and/or transparency measures would make a whole host of things more helpful, including the fact that civil society organizations have been assisting the platforms in doing their work for years. And the way we do that is when they throw us any sort of bone to give us some data access. So they've been cutting off the tools that existed in the first place for us to help them with their own work. And they've not put in place replacement investment in teams internally to make up for the what they won't be getting from civil society, or what they won't be able to show, largely, you could imagine, to avoid accountability. I'd also say that we have seen, and I also won't be specific, but we have seen some tech leadership really court governments around the world in a sense that indicates to us that they understand that their platforms can have a disproportionate impact on election outcomes. And I think that if we don't rein in some of the centralized control of the very few platforms that are where majority of voters are spending time online, we're going to see them continue to see the way that they put policies in place and the way that they build or break down relationships with government actors as a sort of a chess a chess game where voters lose out and users lose out. So that is a concern for me, and I don't know specifically what to do about that, but transparency would help so we could get to accountability.
Again, this is a subject matter I'm not well versed, but I can tell you, I go back to the general media, and the traditional media's responsibility to ensure that accurate information is being given. Because if we're relying on the tech companies to give that information, we know that's not occurring. So where do we go? We go back to traditional media. And as somebody who started their career out of law school in broadcast media, I understand the importance of the media. One of my best friends runs a rural newspaper company. He has 50 publications throughout the United States. And understanding their business model and the struggles they're having every day to meet payroll and ensure that they can employ strong journalism is an issue. But again, it's how are we going to get the information to the basic voter on the local level that's accurate and correct? Because that's how they're going to make decisions. And if we think they are getting that information, they're not. We know print media is important to broadcast media, and it's a circle. But if they're not getting access to that print media, broadcast media is not going to give the information to the local voter that we.
Well, I want to thank you all so very much for taking the time to answer some of these questions, for all of these questions, actually. I'm going to turn it over to Willa to facilitate the Q&A. If you are joining us as a participant, please feel free to drop in the chat any questions you may have, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. Willa, I'm going to turn it over to you for a minute.
Thank you, Carah. And thank you everyone for joining. And thank you to our panelists for an already fascinating discussion. I want to give the audience a chance to engage a bit. So I'll start with a question from Steve. And Steve asks that we read reports about the threats against election workers, but there doesn't seem to be any legal action. Is that because the source hasn't been identified or because law enforcement doesn't prosecute threats against election workers? Big question. Secretary Wyman, I'll start with you.
Okay. Well, this is something that the election community really learned following 2020 when we saw a huge uptick in harassing emails and phone calls and threats being made against local and state election officials. And so we started working with Department of Justice and reporting all of these and found that very few of them were being taken up and even fewer were being prosecuted, which was a huge source of frustration in the election community. And that actually started some really healthy dialogue between law enforcement and local election officials that's been happening over the last 4 years. And what we found is, unfortunately, and fortunately, I guess, a threat has to raise to the level of a legal standard for law enforcement to respond, which is a good thing. And so many of the threats that we received, again, at all levels of government, have been non-actionable. So they are horrible. I hope that I see you hanging from a tree at the end of the week. That's a horrible thing to say. It is not legally actionable for law enforcement to go and arrest someone for exercising their free speech rights about how they think you're doing your job. And so they have to be actionable. So it has to be, I'm going to come and shoot you. And so that was really, I think, the biggest thing that's happened over this last 4 years is really understanding that law enforcement has real specific things that they can and can't respond to. Now, the good news, I like to always have a good part of these stories, is there's been a lot of work done on the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, which it connects law enforcement and local election officials. And out of some of our early discussions, the committee started creating what we call pocket guides. And these pocket guides are a list of the local state laws, the state laws in each of the 50 states. And I think we have almost all 50 states participating. And this is something that a law enforcement official could carry with them on the job because, let's face it, they don't deal with election law very often. And now they know exactly what statutes apply in an election situation. They understand what they can and can't do in a polling place, for example, if something's occurring. And it really helps them start that conversation with their local election officials so they can start anticipating what they're going to do on election day or during their voting period. Where are the lanes? Where does law enforcement have a role? Where can they not go? Because some states, they can't go into a polling place, for example. So all of these conversations are good. And it goes back to that resilience that election officials are trying to build into the system going into November, is having those conversations with police offices and sheriff's offices now. So when election day gets here, everybody knows what their role is, who to call, who to contact, and how to respond.
Thank you,
You know,
Secretary.
sorry, I was just going to say, when I became secretary, our biggest initiative at the legislative session was passing a bill to make it a felony to harass or intimidate election workers. We got that passed unanimously through this legislature with bipartisan support. As soon as it passed the legislature, our Republican governor immediately signed it. It went into effect. We then went to meet with the sheriffs throughout the state to talk about the law and what the impacts of the law meant. We gave them guidance. We gave them training guidelines to train their officers who do manage election. We have an election integrity task force that's made up of local, state, and federal law enforcement to talk about these issues as we are leading up to the election and on the day of the election. Again, we passed this bill because we were one of 7 cases that DOJ decided to prosecute. However, the individual clearly had been harassing, intimidating, and threatening my staff in the secretary's office. However, one person out of 11 members of the jury decided he didn't meet one of the 4 elements of the law. So we thought, okay, we're going to fix this. We're going to make sure that the law exists for individuals to be prosecuted. Unfortunately, there are a group of individuals in this state who have challenged that law at the federal level. We won our first case. However, they're now appealing to the Ninth Circuit because they're saying it's chilling their free speech. We are confident that we wrote the law in a strong way to protect election workers. But again, it comes down to, as soon as you prosecute that first case, you better make sure that case is strong enough to ensure that the law continues to be available to us as election workers.
Thank you to you both. I have a question from Jordan now. And he asks, what opportunities are available to train and recruit trusted messengers to counter misinformation at scale to the average voter? I can start with you, Secretary Wyman.
Oh, I was hoping you were going to go with, I was going to be second. Okay. I think right now, some of the nonprofit organizations that work in the election space, like Issue One, Brennan Center for Justice, I'm trying to, this was a good question, Bipartisan Policy Center, the Election Group, all of us are working to not only try to figure out what are good, solid talking points to talk about the security measures that are common across all 50 states. How do elections work at a level that is easy to articulate to any audience? And then, so I know that, like I said, on the Bipartisan Policy website, that would be bipartisanpolicy.org. You can go on to that site, and we have a piece that we just released, and I am completely blanking on the name, but it is showing all of the common security measures that are in place, and takes it to a simple level. And then it really is going to the business community, to faith-based leaders in communities across the country, and having these conversations at a community level and talking about how elections are run at your local election office, talking to your local clerk or auditor or supervisor of elections, and getting that information out and sharing it. That's all going to help when we get to November.
One thing we did is we tried to figure out, who do voters trust in Nevada? We did polling, and we found that veterans and firefighters are the most trusted advocates when it comes to elections. And so we immediately took that information and said, let's develop a strategy to engage veterans and firefighters. So we partnered with Vet the Vote, which has been a significant partnership in getting voters to the polls, right? If we're talking about veterans and getting them engaged and being poll workers, they are there, they are seeing the process, they're experiencing the process, and they're talking to their friends and family members and community members about the process and how secure it is. It's been a phenomenal relationship. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to speak at the VFW state conference, and we talked about veterans engaging in the elections process. They know they've already fought for us to have the freedoms that we have. Now they know the responsibility of serving our country in a time of need when our elections are under attack. And when you talk to them and engage with them, it's a fascinating opportunity. We are working and engaging. We're going to meet with our fire chiefs in the north and the south to talk about getting firefighters involved on election day. When you talk about transporting ballots from the polling site to the election center, making firefighters a part of that. Also, too, some of our poll worker managers get harassed on election day. And as they're leaving polling sites, they get followed. And so we're establishing relationships with the fire station closest to that polling site so that a poll worker can drive immediately to the fire station, call ahead and say, hey, I'm being followed. Do you mind if I pull into the fire station? The firefighters come out and that person following them knows that they're being protected by firefighters. And also, too, getting firefighters to transport ballots, right? If they get involved in the process in some minimal way, you're building that trust, you're building knowledge base among people that our community trusts.
And I can just add that ISD and Super Strategic Dialogue works with a number of grassroots organizations that are connecting to folks like firefighters, coaches, teachers, people with high social capital in local communities. And what I'd encourage folks to think about, regardless of the trust that they are creating, is also just the distribution plan, because we really need a lot of repetition. And we need a lot of focus on not just audiences that we have no connection to, but the no matter how small audiences we do have a connection to, because I can't emphasize enough how much so people are in a passive brain scrolling in their news feeds and are not actively consuming much of what is in their feed. If anyone thinks to themselves what they can recall from what they saw on social media yesterday, I'd remark that likely many of us can't think of much. And that shift in being in a passive state means that in-person conversation, phone calls, an email chain that you ask your grandma to send her 3 friends. I mean, whatever it is, there's something anyone can do. And within that, I'd say repetition, and then ensuring that you never approach messaging about some of these threats as if anyone is better than anyone else for being vulnerable to them, because the level of sophistication that exists in 2024 is such that all of us could fall for some of the deception that exists, whether it's thinking a local news outlet is actually a local news outlet because it looks like one, but it's actually foreign run, or whether it's a text message that's hyper personal to you. So making sure there's no condescension and that you're leading with empathy and sort of the connection point of saying, we're all overwhelmed by this information environment. Let's just talk about our plan for how we're going to get information in the coming months.
Thank you, Jiore. Yeah, so this next question is a pretty smooth segue, because we've talked a little bit about what tech companies can do, what legislatures can do, and what public officials themselves can do. But this question says, what can we as everyday citizens / voters do to help? And this could be for the spread of misinformation or just protecting election workers. Jiore, do you want to start?
Can you just repeat the second part of that? I was reading a question in the chat.
Yeah, so I think this person just wants to know what the everyday person can do.
Yes, definitely. So the things I just mentioned are really important and great. I think that there are a lot of things frustrating about our current information environment that we all feel, right? It's so easy to think like, wow, there are these people who seem to disagree with me, or these people who seem so set on being at odds with me, but there's so much we do agree. We're all overwhelmed by the notifications coming at us and information coming at us. So I would say that if you can open conversations with people and talk about, hey, there might be some trickery and deception coming your way, here's what it might look like. And if you can find really apolitical examples to illustrate what kind of information threats might exist. I often use one about dolphins being in the canal during the pandemic that the National Geographic had to correct that I fell for, just as a conversation starter. The other thing is really making people earn the information you're believing. So I tell people that in today's information environment, you should have a really high bar for what you're willing to accept. And if you look at who is putting information out there that provides transparency, that talks about who their board is, talks about who their funding is, I mean, that should be the minimum standard. And if you apply that logic to the information you're going to rely on to make decisions about how to vote, you really think about, did that person earn it, or did it just fit my preconceptions? you might end up putting a little bit more thought into what you're going to at least repeat. And I'd say that anyone, no matter what knowledge they have around elections, can be engaging in a conversation about things like that, because it is truly anybody who has a smartphone or anybody who's using a computer. So very relevant to all of us.
It's simple. It's decency, right? Is when you go to a polling location, thanking the poll worker for being there. Talk to your friends about the responsibilities of a poll worker. They're not there to be political. They're there to protect our fundamental right to vote and give us access to the ballot box. It starts with your local neighbors. It starts with your families, to remind them that we need to bring decency back into this process. We need to recognize those individuals that are stepping up, and we need to thank them. We need to make them cool. We need to make them feel as though they're respected, and we need people to understand, again, this is not about politics. They're there to ensure we have the right to vote.
And just to highlight or to amplify Secretary Aguilar's comments, another thing to think about is becoming a poll worker or working at an early voting site in your community, or being an extra help employee in a vote by mail state where they need people to come in and help them process ballots during the voting period. All of those activities will give you such unique insight into the election process, the security measures that are in place, and how they actually conduct an election in your community. And then you can go out to your circle of influence, your friends, your family, your neighbors, and share what you know. And I'll tell you, that's more powerful than anything I could have done as a local election official or even Secretary of State, because those people trust you in a different way than they trust an unknown, politician or elected official.
Right now is the time to step up to be a poll worker. We're trying to be creative about how we hurt poll workers. I've been in a struggle with the Nevada Bar Association to give CLE credits to lawyers. But you know what? There's big firms in the state are calling me and saying, hey, we don't care about the CLE credit. We want our whole firm to work a polling site. And they are allowing their lawyers to go out there, get the training, and then to go serve as poll workers. And I think that's incredible. I think that shows the value of how lawyers are really respecting this process. The other thing we've really focused on is recruiting youth. We tried to do a pilot project with the Boys and Girls Club. We didn't get the recruitment we wanted. So we went to a local high school, Cristo Rey High School, who has an innovative workforce development program where the kids work 1 day a week. And so they understand the responsibility of being in a mature environment. We went to the school, talked to the students about being a poll worker. 28 of the students signed up. Unfortunately, they missed the training because of finals and other responsibilities, but a few of them are going to be poll workers. And getting youth involved. In Nevada, you only need to be 16 to be a poll worker. You get them into a process they never knew existed. You maybe create that hunger in their belly to get involved further, but you're bringing somebody from the neighborhood, the community, to sit in a polling site. Those families, those Theos are going to show up to see their nephew working that polling site. You're also bringing in language access because they speak the language of the community. So people in the community are going to be comfortable showing up knowing that Johnny's there to help them through the process.
Well, I think we will end on that very high note. I love that we have ideas for what we can all do about this. And just to Secretary Aguilar's point, we know from studies that participating directly in the process actually increases confidence in it. And so please join and participate, and also spread good information about how elections work. We do have a website at Issue 1 called howelectionswork.org, and that will direct everyone directly to the state websites where they are. So happy to share that information as well. Jiore Craig with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, Secretary Kim Wyman, and Secretary Cisco Aguilar, thank you so much for joining us to share your expertise and your insights on these issues as we face a challenging election year. You all give me hope. And we are excited to be in this work with you all and to be supporting you however we can at Issue 1. And I also want to thank Willa Blake for helping organize this event and to all of your teams for helping make it possible too. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful weekend.